So I hope I was able to convey something about what neural correlates of consciousness are in the last video. We talked about it's this idea that for every conscious experience we can have, every conscious experience that our brain can generate in this internal reality that our brain produces, there is some corresponding pattern of activity in the brain that maps across to that somehow maps precisely across to every aspect of that experience. Every part of our experience must be accounted for by some activity in the brain somewhere. We could say a lot of the research is focused on visual experience because visual experience is very familiar. We know a lot about the visual pathways, and we think that if we can solve vision, then some of this may carry across to the other senses, and we perhaps won't have so much work to do. So it's this idea that similar to a digital camera, if you take a picture on a digital camera, then that picture is represented in your computer's memory by strings of zeros and ones. This could be a smiley face. But if we change that pattern of zeros and ones, then we get a different image, perhaps a mountain or something. We change the pattern, we change the image. And the same goes in your brain. There is patterns of activity. It's not zeros and ones. It's interactions between neurons, the movement and flow of atoms and ions, and we could imagine the sheer amount of possibilities in the brain. If we imagine every frame of every movie that we've ever seen or ever will see must be represented by a different pattern of activity, then it kind of gives us an idea about just how many states the brain can be in order to represent each of those. And we could say that if we could somehow get the brain to put it into that same pattern of activity again, your brain would produce that same visual field. That one frame from that one movie would be produced in your visual field as you would experience the visual qualia of that experience. And so for every qualia of every sense, from the feelings of emotions and pains and itches and various different sensations, some activity in the brain maps across to that. So in this video, we're just going to talk a bit more about some of the research, just a quick introduction to the way that this is being studied and the way that we can begin to find out about that. And we'll do this by talking about lots of things, beginning with the word blind. The first of which we'll say is blind sight. So what's blind sight? Blind sight is a neurological condition where a person well, the important things about the condition is that a person says that they are blind. They have no vision, they have no conscious visual field. This projection, this qualia visual experience that your brain is producing right now, they don't have it. They are blind. They think it's just darkness. But the second thing we need to know is that the eyes are completely intact in blind sight. The damage is actually to the back of the brain in the primary visual cortex. And the third thing is that they actually seem to have they can respond to visual information although they report being blind. What does this mean? So a blind sight patient might be able to be put in a room and asked to walk across the room, but we put a chair in their way, and they will actually avoid the chair without knowing how, or without sometimes even knowing that they've moved around something. They don't see the chair, they don't see anything, they have no visual experience. But they avoid the chair. Okay, they're beginning to get a bit weird. Furthermore, mischievous researchers decided it would be fun to hold cards up in front of some blind sight patients with X's or zeros on, and they would ask the patient, what card am I holding up in front of you now? And the patient would perhaps get angry, how am I supposed to answer this? I'm blind, you fool, haven't you been listening to me? And the researcher would say, just have a go, take a guess, give it your best shot. And the blind sight patient would take a wild guess. They would pick an answer out of the air, and more often than not, far more often than chance, almost as often as people with full conscious vision would, they would get it absolutely correct, and not knowing how. So this is a very strange thing. And how has this arisen? So let's look at these visual pathways to get some ideas about why blind sight might occur and what it could be about, and how it relates to neural correlates of consciousness, or at least of conscious vision. So this is kind of a model of our visual pathways. It shows the visual pathways coming from each eye, meeting in the thalamus here and going around to the primary visual cortex. Now this is the main pathway to the primary visual cortex. About 90% of visual information from the eyes, all the light that strikes those light sensitive cells on the eyes, triggers a reaction that ends up in the primary visual cortex. Most of your visual information ends here and begins to be processed here. And it's this area that's damaged in blind sight. So, and this seems to cause, this seems to be enough to stop conscious visual experience. And one of the ways then that researchers have explained the idea that there is still the capability to somehow use visual information to guide certain actions is that there's a secondary pathway. That remaining 10% of visual information actually splits off and goes to the superior colliculi, which is the collicular pathway of vision. And this seems to be, we could talk about this area as it contains lots and lots of neurons. It's very complex. It's it's neural stuff. But it doesn't seem to contain the right stuff, whatever that right stuff may be, for visual conscious awareness. It's enough here to inform a person's behaviour, but it's not enough to produce this conscious projection of visual qualia that we have. It just doesn't seem to have the right stuff. And this again, when we talked in the second video about visual agnosias, we mentioned this idea of looking for deficits caused by brain trauma, looking for what was left intact, and then trying to explain something about function. And we can do that here. If we talk about the deficits is a lack of conscious vision. What's intact is this ability to still use visual information. And again, this shows us that we perhaps would have thought intuitively that we need conscious visual experience in order to guide our actions. As I'm reaching out towards my cup now, I believe it seems very much like it's my visual experience of the cup that allows me to move my hand, and I could see my hand moving towards it. That allows me to slow down my hand as I approach it, grasp the handle, and take a sip from the drink. But this blind sight shows that this is not really the case. It shows that there's a dissociation between that, and perhaps shows us something about function. But is the primary visual cortex a neural correlate? Can we say from this that the primary visual cortex is where conscious visual perception is created in the universe? Is this the right stuff right here for the creation of that? Well, the answer seems to probably be no, and we'll have a look at why that is using an example of a study called binocular rivalry. Now, in binocular rivalry, we would have an image, and we could present an image to each eye. In this case, I just whipped this off Google. In this case, the researchers used a face and a building, but in other research, it's been like things as simple as a vertical grating and a horizontal grating, one to each eye. And what actually happens in this, and you can show yourself rivalry between the eyes by looking one eye through a toilet tube and holding your hand in front of the other eye until you see the hole in your hand. What occurs with binocular rivalry is that you don't perceive an overlapping of both visual scenes. Instead, your brain flips between one and the other. So what's important here is that each eye the stimulus in each eye is always the same. It never changes. There's always light falling on the eye. So the neurons in the back of the eye, these light sensitive cells, are always going to be activated by these images falling on the eye. And they're going to pass that signal, they're going to transmit that information to the optic nerve. So that's going to be active. But in this case, we rely on the fact that it flips between the two in consciousness. So consciousness changes, whereas the stimulus in the world doesn't. And we can actually, in these tests, it's actually a monkey. But if it was a person, we could ask the person to tell us whether they're experiencing the face or the building or the vertical grating or the horizontal grating, and to tell us when it changes. And we can actually train monkeys to do this. ingenious researchers have trained monkeys to do this. So the monkey can report which one it's experiencing, and what we're looking for is neurons that are active not because there's light falling on the eye, but neurons that are active and that switch off and switch on in relation to the report of the conscious visual experience, to the monkey saying, now I see this and now I see that. So in the optic nerve, these neurons are active regardless of what the monkey is perceiving. These neurons are active just because there's light falling in the eye. And that goes again for the thalamus. And as we come round to the primary visual cortex, this area of interest for us, it still seems that much of the neurons here correspond, they are active as long as there's light falling on the eye. They don't switch on and off or change in relationship to the change in perception. So it seems that we could say that if we have a chain, a neural pathway, which starts with the eyes, moves to the thalamus, off to the primary visual cortex, and then beyond, we could say that if we damage the eyes, that's going to stop the flow of information to the rest of the pathway, leading to blindness. The same for the thalamus, or if we cut off the primary visual cortex, as in blind sight, again, it cuts off visual information to the rest of the field. So it could be that it's this bunch of neurons here, which we don't know what they are, which are responsible for producing, actually projecting visual consciousness into existence. It could be this, but the information to this area is cut off when the primary visual cortex is damaged. So we could say that the primary visual cortex is not an actual neural correlate for consciousness. It's earlier in the chain. And we find that out by doing this binocular rivalry research. And then we could find more neurons that leave the primary visual cortex and make connections in the temporal lobe and follow these around until eventually in the temporal lobe we begin to find neurons that maybe it's one bunch of neurons are active when the horizontal lines are being perceived and they switch off, and another set of neurons switch on when the perception flips to the vertical lines. And those neurons can then flip back and forward, and we could perhaps even go so far as to be able to predict what the person is experiencing before they are able to tell us. We could look at which neurons are on at that moment and say, you're seeing the horizontal grating, aren't you? And they would say yes, or the monkey, if we could train the monkey to say yes, he would. So that's binocular rivalry and blind sight. Our second example of the word blind is going to be the blind spot. The blind spot, and this will go hand in hand with motion-induced blindness. And I just want to use these two illusions as we close now to illustrate these two ends of the visual pathway, this part at the beginning and the part at the end, and how they can both cause perceptual illusions, and then we can begin to just think about how that relates to neural correlates of consciousness. So the blind spot, if you've never seen the blind spot, I mean, I did this at primary school. I used to love doing this. The blind spot is this kind of illusion where you would close your left eye and move your right eye towards this cross. And eventually, I think I'm about 10 inches from the screen, and the black spot has disappeared. And if I move my mouse over here, the mouse cursor disappears. And we could actually replace this black spot with some complex patterns. And our brain doesn't just paint white over everything, it fills in what it thinks should be there. So I was playing around with this yesterday at a zebra print pattern, and my brain was quite capable of filling in zebra print over the blind spot. So what's important about blind spot for purposes here is that the blind spot isn't to do with the visual pathway right round in the cortex or off in the primary visual area. This is to do with the physiology of the eye. Okay, the eye, the blood vessels that enter the eye and the neurons that enter the eye come in through this pathway, and so at this region at the back of the eye there are no photosensitive cells. So the reason you have the blind spot is that there is no visual information coming from that region. There are no neurons being activated that tell you there's light at that region because there are no neurons there. So we don't actually, it's a physiological limitation that gives rise to the blind spot, a physiological limitation at the eye, at the very tip of the iceberg of the nervous system, of perception. So that's, and let's have a look at motion-induced blindness. Motion-induced blindness illusion. I've already got that set. Let's go to there. So motion-induced blindness, and this is a kind of illusion that, I love this one as well. So you stare at the green dot in the middle, the flashing green dot, and as I'm doing this now, and there they go. The yellow spots in the triangle around just start to disappear. All of them are gone now. Now 2 of them are on. Now 1 of them's back on, and they're all flashing in and out of my conscious visual field. And not only that, but our brain's doing a pretty good job of making it seem like there's no blank spots there. It's actually filling in the blanks for us. So with motion-induced blindness then, the yellow spots, light from the yellow spots is always being received by neurons at the back of the eye. That information is always being transmitted down the optic nerve. That information is being passed on to the primary visual cortex, but somewhere further towards the end of the pathway, there are neurons that are switching on and off at the same time as those yellow spots are blinking in and out of our conscious field, of our visual qualia. And it's producing a different visual qualia as those neurons switch on and off. So that's kind of, I like those 2 illusions because they show us the 2 ends, how the 2 ends of the visual pathways can give rise to very similar illusions in 2 very, very different ways. So the big questions that come from these is not just about whether this is the bunch of neurons that produce visual experience and how do they produce visual experience. We want to know kind of the things, what causes these to switch on and off? Why do the yellow spots in the motion-induced blindness example, why do they switch on and off when they do? What causes them to go on and off at the time rate they do? And what are the causes of that? And we would hope to find the same things out about binocular rivalry. What causes the flipping between the 2 and so on. So this is, I hope this has just kind of brought a bit clearer about the neural correlates. You've got a bit of an idea about some of the ways we can search for them and about how we're looking for neurons that switch on and off in relation to in relation to changes in conscious experience, specifically at the moment in conscious visual experience. So I'll leave it there and I'll catch up with you in the next video.